The next video, instead of a story, I thought I'd let one of my favorite philosophers tell this story. His name is Alain de Botton, and he's a British philosopher. And one of the things that he does is he writes like a 4 or 5 minute speech, and then he delivers it. He's got one of those sonorous British accents. And then he hands off his script to various artists. And the artist in today's video is a claymation stop action thing. So I just wanted to give you a warning that it's a little bit different. So let's take a look at the video of Alain de Botton on eudaimonia.
Eudaimonia is an ancient Greek word, particularly emphasized by the philosophers Plato, that does a currency than it has because it corrects the shortfalls in one of the most central, governing but insufficient words in our contemporary language, happiness. When we nowadays try to articulate the purpose of our lives, it's to the word happiness that we commonly have recourse. We tell ourselves and others that the ultimate rationale for our jobs, our relationships, and the day lives is the pursuit of happiness. It sounds like an innocent enough idea, but excessive reliance on the term means that we are frequently unfairly tempted to exit, or at least heavily question, a great many testing situations. The ancient Greeks did not believe that they would be happy. They proposed that it was to achieve eudaimonia, a word which has been best translated as fulfillment. What distinguishes happiness from fulfillment is pain. It is eminently possible to be fulfilled and, at the same time, suffering physically or mentally, overburdened, and quite frequently in a tetchy mood. This is a psychological nuance that the word happiness makes it hard to capture. For it's tricky to speak of being happy or however, accommodated within the sounding letters of eudaimonia. The word encourages us to trust that many of life's most worthwhile projects will at points be quite at odds with contentment, and yet will be worth pursuing nevertheless. Properly exploring our professional talents, managing a household, keeping a relationship going, creating a new business venture, or engaging in politics. Of these goals as cheerful basis. In fact, involve us in all manner of challenges that will deeply exhaust and enervate us, provoke and wound us. And yet we will perhaps, at the end of our lives, still feel that the tasks were worth undertaking. Through them, we'll have accessed something grander and more interesting than happiness. We'll have made a difference. With the word eudaimonia in mind, we can stop imagining that we're aiming for a pain and bereft for being. We'll know something far more important than smile all the time. We're striving to do justice to our full human potential, and to work in some small but key way towards the improvement of our species.
Second Lieutenant Arpad Szabo, a poor first-generation Hungarian-American, 23 years old in 1944. He'd been a combat soldier for over 3 years, actively participating in some of World War II's most horrific fighting. North Africa and Sicily under General Patton, then Salerno, Monte Cassino, and Anzio, Italy under General Clark. In May of that year, excuse me, while on a foot patrol northeast of Rome, he encountered the new German super tank, a Tiger tank. 67 tons, 24 feet long, armor 7 inches thick, and a crew of 5. So what does my rash, impetuous father do? He attacks it. Just him and his rifle. His war name was Wild One. Sounds about right. He runs to the tank, jumps on top, killing and wounding the crew. But Tiger tanks always travel in pairs. So while he's doing his thing on top of the tank, just 30 yards away is a second Tiger tank shooting at him, throwing a hand grenade. His rifle is hit, it explodes, the grenade nearby explodes, and he is now without a weapon and exposed. Now wounded and unarmed, he jumps off the tank, finds his unit, gets another rifle, orders a sergeant with a rocket launcher to follow him back to the remaining tank. Sabo tells his sergeant to fire at the tank when you see me emerge out of the bushes. So within seconds, Sabo jumps out and runs at the second tank. Meanwhile, his sergeant, as the tank turns towards my father, the sergeant shoots rocket-propelled grenade 3 times, striking the tank. And so the tank crew, I can only imagine, being struck 3 times by a bazooka and seeing that same guy running at them that they had just seen earlier on the first tank. They decide they've had enough and they back up and retreat. The action resulted in my father being awarded the Distinguished Service Cross for extraordinary heroism and action. We talked together about this experience in terms of Aristotle's virtue ethics. I suppose that's the kind of talk, the father-son talk, that a philosophy professor and a veteran father engage in, but he was good with it. And virtue ethics is what I would like to talk about this morning. We study ethics in order to know how to improve the quality of our lives and the world we live in. In virtue ethics, a virtue is a state of mind. It's an outlook, an attitude, a quality of action, a personal asset. We are not born with virtues. Virtues are freely chosen habits that can be consciously and rationally cultivated. They aren't biological inheritances that some people naturally possess a virtue and others do not. Our upbringing, education, and our social life contribute to our ability to acquire virtues and then throughout our lives, practice them. Virtues are rational, emotional, and social skills, a kind of practical wisdom, where by cultivating and practicing them, the result is that we can experience a deeper level of well-being. Being virtuous enables our lives to flourish. As we learned from the video, Aristotle uses the word eudaimonia, or eudaimonia, the British pronunciation's a little different, which means human flourishing, to describe the result of living a life that cultivates and practices as many virtues as are applicable in any given situation. Now, the list of virtues has changed over the millennia, and I have a handout when you leave that you can take a look at with all the various kinds of virtues listed in it. Some have fallen out of favor. Some definitions of virtues have changed. Every society has its own list of virtues. Aristotle identified 12 virtues. These were later adopted by the Roman Catholic Church, and the philosophy of virtues has influenced Western civilization for centuries. Our own Unitarian Universalist Association's national body has developed an educational program in 2012 called Virtue Ethics, an ethical development program for high school youth, which promotes its own list of virtues. In Aristotle's ethical theory, the best virtuous action is a condition between excess or deficiency. This condition is popularly known as the golden mean. Richard Kraut from Northwestern University says this, quote, "The courageous person, for example, judges that some dangers are worth facing and others not, and experiences fear to a degree that is appropriate to the circumstances. The golden mean lies between being the coward, who flees every danger and experiences excessive fear, and the rash person, who judges every danger worth facing and experiences little or no fear. Aristotle holds that this same topography applies to every ethical virtue. All are located on a map that places the virtues between states of excess and deficiency. Aristotle is careful to add, however, that the mean is to be determined in a way that takes into account the particular circumstances of the individual. Courage is a virtue, of which the excess is rash choices and foolish actions, like attacking a tank with a rifle. The deficiency of courage is, as we know, cowardice. The proper amount of courage would be a well-considered action, like taking a rocket launcher next time. Dad said his first attack, when we were talking about virtue ethics and having this father-son conversation, he said that was really foolish. But then I found out later this is not what he thought was foolish and what I thought was foolish, two different things. It wasn't that he was attacked the tank with a rifle, but that he forgot that tanks always travel in pairs. That was foolish. The witnesses to his action didn't know that the first attack was foolish and that the second attack was well considered. For the witnesses, it just looked like courage. Now, virtues have to be cultivated by blending our reason and our life experience and introspection to figure out when acting virtuously is too much, too little, just the right amount. It's a Goldilocks kind of a thing. The best application of the virtue is that sweet spot between excess and deficiency, ascertaining the golden mean. Finding the best expression of any virtue takes a lifetime. It is cultivated, practiced, exercised, experimented with. We have all had that, dealing with somebody. That didn't work very well. That's that kind of practical knowledge. Well, I won't do that again. It is a journey, not a destination. Its application is always different depending on diverse factors. It's never the same. It always varies depending on who, what, when, where, history, how, relationships, condition. Every life situation, including how we think of ourselves, our actions, entails multiple virtues. And while it sounds impossible, life is more fulfilling when we engage more virtues in any given situation, seeking the golden mean within and among the active virtues. So whenever you're in any situation, Aristotle says, you just don't take one virtue, you take them all. And by the time we reach our age, we've already practiced them, and we've failed, and we've succeeded, and we've learned enough that we know that the next time maybe we should do it a little bit differently. That is that practical wisdom that Aristotle speaks about. Right time, right way, right person, right balance, right virtues. In trying to be virtuous, we flourish. Now, with the handout, I invite you to take a look at it, and here's an exercise that I used to offer my students. And that is, you find a virtue, and then you think of what would be too much of it. Right? So we think about courage, too much courage, rash, attacking a tank with a rifle, or too little. So this is the thing. So there's all these virtues, and it's a great conversation starter. I was single once before I met my one true love, and I was speaking with a woman that I was on a date with, and she had this kind of conversation starter thing that she got out of Cosmopolitan magazine. This is a true story. And we're, she was going through the different questions from Cosmo, and one of them was, what do you think is the most overrated virtue? Right? I, as a young man, I was thinking, chastity. Chastity, yeah. Can I get you another glass of wine? No, I'm kidding. All right. So you write it down, too much, too little, and you have all of these kinds of virtues. And it's a great exercise for yourself. And if you haven't been introduced to all of these various kinds of virtues. Consider what it would be like then, for example, let's take trust. Too little trust. You're always skeptical, you're afraid, you don't risk anything. And then there'd be too much. Sure, whatever. Too much, too little. Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. This is a quote from a book called The Court and character of King James. It's a book of virtues to be practiced in the court of King James. It's written by Anthony Weldon, 1651. Even more ancient, carved into the lintel of the ancient temple of Apollo at Delphi, Greece, are words that have deeply influenced Western civilization for thousands of years. Nothi Seutan, carved into the marble lintel, means know thyself. This self-knowledge that we have of the quality of our actions and our social landscape is a necessary part of cultivating virtue ethics. Let me continue to mix my metaphors. Self-knowledge and how that introspection translates into how we virtuously interact with each other are the ingredients of our human flourishing. Mix up those virtues. Add a different one in a given situation. Living well by cultivating virtue is the recipe for happiness. I said I was going to mix my metaphors. Virtues are rational, emotional, and social skills, as well as a state of mind and a quality of action. The spiritual discipline of cultivating these virtues is itself a means of flourishing. We practice them with the hope that we can flourish as our truest selves. Philosopher Daniel Hebron at St. Louis University states, quote, "There are roughly 2 philosophical literatures on happiness, each corresponding to a different sense of the term. One uses happiness as a value term, roughly synonymous with well-being or flourishing. The other body of work uses the word as a purely descriptive psychological term, like the opposite of depression, or more like tranquility. It's more of a feeling. It's the smiling part of happiness that we're so aware of. Philosophers who write about happiness typically take as their subject matter to be either 2 things, each corresponding to a different sense of the term. Firstly, happiness is a state of mind, and secondly, that life goes well for a person leading it," end quote. I'm of a philosopher that goes with the first definition of happiness. In the video we saw of eudaimonia, human flourishing and well-being, that's the kind of happiness. You don't have to smile, but the flourishing part, it acts on us when we are practicing the virtues. I suggest revising the meaning of happiness as a life that goes according to plan, which of course it never does, and in getting more of what you desire, to the other kind, the kind of happiness which isn't a recipe for unhappiness, like I didn't get what I want, I'm going to be unhappy. Rather, to find the meaning and flourish in a life which doesn't always give us what we want. Like Mick Jagger sang, you can't always get what you want. Life isn't fair. Suffering is a part of life. It is not punishment. Thanks to our universalism, we no longer think of suffering, failure, and tragedy as predestined divine judgment. Virtue looks at suffering from the perspective of flourishing. We don't have to feel happy to flourish. One can still flourish with illness and grief with an attitude of virtue. We can flourish even as we experience suffering. A little story. Once upon a time, there was a group of Hasidic pilgrims arguing among themselves as to who had endured the most suffering, and so who was most entitled to complain. They couldn't decide among themselves, arguing who had suffered the most, so they asked their rabbi, and the rabbi told them this story. On the day of judgment, no, I'm not going to do an accent. All right, on the day of judgment, each person will be allowed to hang one's sorrows on a branch of the great tree. After having found a limb from which their sorrows may dangle, they may then walk around the great tree so that they can search for other sufferings of other people that are hanging there, and they can take whatever ones they like that they prefer to their own sufferings. Drop yours off, pick up somebody else's. In the end, each person reclaims their own assortments of sorrows and sufferings rather than those of another. The rabbi concludes, sufferings are beyond comparison. And though our own sufferings influence the kind of person we are, they are not everything we are. A spiritual discipline cultivating the virtues amidst suffering enables us to flourish. Again, Professor Hebron says, what we need in order to live well is a mindful appreciation of the way in which good things of life, friendship, pleasure, virtue, honor, and wealth fit together as a whole, in order to apply that general understanding to particular cases. We must cultivate, through proper upbringing and habits, the ability to see on each occasion which course of virtuous action is best supported by reasons. End quote. The choices and actions that lead to a flourishing, fulfilling life are found in the spiritual discipline that rationally cultivates a virtuous attitude, outlook, or state of mind. Professor Hebron provides an example, quote, consider a juror who must determine whether a defendant is guilty as charged. She does not have before her mind a quantitative question. She is trying to decide whether the accused committed the crime and is not looking for some quantity of action, immediate, between extremes. Nonetheless, an excellent juror can be described as someone who, in trying to arrive at the correct decision, seeks to express the right degree of concern for all the relevant considerations. She searches for the verdict that results from a deliberative process that is neither overly credulous nor unduly skeptical, end quote. In virtue ethics, it is not possible to write a handbook of virtue rules. Can't be done. There is no comprehensive guide to decision-making in every situation. So how does a virtuous person aim at that golden mean between too little virtue, too much virtue? And because it's been practiced for thousands of years, there's lots of suggestions. One helpful suggestion is to give each situation, each person, careful consideration. The impetuous person shortchanges rational deliberation, and so doesn't make a reasoned choice. Let me attack the tank with a rifle. The other side is when the person overthinks it and makes an ethical choice that is insufficient or weak, inadequate. This procedure of rational consideration to ascertain the golden mean is why cultivating a virtue takes a lifetime of practice. Most of us don't have to think too long about what we're going to do in a particular situation. We've been in this situation before. We know what works, what doesn't work. We know our strengths and weaknesses. We are the result of the introspection and sufferings and life experiences. And when we come to make a decision, to say something, to act in a certain way, we more or less know pretty much what we're going to do. And it's really great when it works out, but it doesn't always. Practicing virtue ethics as a spiritual discipline is not a decision-making process, but it does illuminate the nature of living well. What might be done on any particular occasion by a virtuous person depends on the circumstances. And these vary so much from one occasion to another that it's not ever possible to state what all the rules are in every situation about what the golden mean is of all the virtues, et cetera, et cetera. You get the point. There are no rule books. You just have to figure it out the best you can. Trying to live virtuously is the path of flourishing. Seeking the best balance between too much and too little is nuanced. What might be best in one situation might not be in another situation. Getting it right all the time is not the goal. It is the effort to cultivate virtues that enables our own flourishing. The spiritual discipline of cultivating virtues allows us to flourish and be happy. Cultivating the garden of virtues is the heart of happiness. Enough of that. Let's sing. Our next hymn is number 347, Gather the Spirit. You may stand or sit as the Spirit moves you.